I don't think he's fit for office. I don't think he has the competence to carry out the job. There really isn't any guiding principle that I was able to discern other than what's good for Donald Trump's reelection.
As the title claims, John Bolton was in the room where it happened. We go inside the pages of the former U.S. National Security Advisor's White House memoir. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. During John Bolton's 17 months as Donald Trump's national security advisor, the United States abandoned the Iran nuclear deal. But Trump and Bolton clashed on many other issues. And depending on who you talk to, Bolton was either fired or resigned last September. Now comes his memoir, which the administration tried to stop from being published. Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Allan Lichtman is a distinguished history professor at American University. He joins us from Bethesda, Maryland. With us from Beijing is Victor Gao. He's a chair professor at Soochow University. John Sitilides joins us here in Washington, D.C. He's a geopolitical strategist and consultant to the U.S. State Department. And with us from the White House is my colleague, CGTN's Nathan King. Nathan, I want to start with you. You've been a reporter, a correspondent in this town for a very long time. You've covered John Bolton, both here in Washington and at the United Nations. And I want to start off with a broad question here. Is there anything in this book that we didn't know? Are there major revelations?
Yeah, there are. I spent last weekend reading it, and I must admit, you know, whatever you think of John Bolton, he's a very good note taker. And while we've had insider accounts and sort of anonymous accounts by journalists, this is the most high-ranking official who literally confirms but also adds to the story. A very chaotic White House, if you believe John Bolton and the others that have written about it. And particularly, he stresses again and again that the US president essentially looks at everything, not as America first, but Trump's re-election first, whether it's dealing with domestic issues, but of course the book is mainly about foreign policy issues, and it's whether it's about China, Russia, Turkey, Syria, Iran. He looks at that through that prism, according to John Bolton. It was a very revealing book in lots of ways, and even though you know, John Bolton, of course, is self-serving, there is not criticism of him in this book, but you do get a broad picture that has been painted before, but he's definitely colored it in a little bit, let's put it that way.
Nathan, did you get the sense that the book may be biased in some ways because, of course, John Bolton was fired by President Trump?
Well, I mean, you know, whether he's fired or whether he resigned or not, he was also hired with great gusto. You remember that, you know, John Bolton has been a fixture on Fox News and the conservative media circuit for many years, and that's where the US president gets a lot of his information. And he really wanted sort of a gung-ho national security advisor. I mean, remember, this is the hawks of all hawks. He's written stuff about bombing Iran, you know, bombing North Korea, etc., etc. But you do get the sense, especially behind the scenes, for example, of the Singapore summit with Kim Jong-un, the president, and the Helsinki summit as well, although we knew a lot about this before, that the US president, because of his background largely, but also because of his personality, it does not pay attention to detail, and it does not want things that contradict his already held opinions.
All right, let me bring in Allan Lichtman. Allan, great to have you back on the show. This book is quite an indictment on the Trump presidency. I mean, he's been called incompetent, not fit to rule. President Trump has responded. In fact, he tweeted, and I'll read that tweet to you. I'm quoting here: Bolton's book, which is getting terrible reviews, is a compilation of lies and made-up stories, all intended to make me look bad. Many of the ridiculous statements he attributes to me were never made, pure fiction. Just trying to get even for firing him like the sick puppy he is. So, Allan, no love lost here, but what do you make of the book?
I think the book is very credible. I have no love for John Bolton. I think he put his own financial interests ahead of the country. He should have testified in front of the House impeachment inquiry. There was absolutely no reason not for him to do so, except to hold his fire so he could get a big book contract. He sold out his country, and Donald Trump is selling out his country. I cannot stress too much how we should stop talking about Donald Trump's incompetence. Thank God he's incompetent. What we need to be talking about is this man is evil. This man is ready to sell out his country, sell out national interest, sell out 1 million minority peoples in China and support putting them in concentration camps simply to promote his own personal and political interests. That's not incompetence, that is evil. And John Bolton's book confirmed what I thought was thoroughly proven in the impeachment investigation, that indeed the President of the United States withheld aid from a vital ally at war with Russia in order to coerce them to investigate his political allies and push the Russian propaganda line that it was really Ukraine, not Russia, that intervened in 2016. These are evil acts, not acts of incompetence.
All right, I want to get to that situation in Ukraine a little later in the show. But John, Sitilides, Bolton, as my colleague Nathan King just told us, was a copious note taker. He took notes in everything. Now, this book covers a number of meetings with foreign leaders and details about those negotiations with those foreign leaders. Should it be dismissed as the bitter words of a disgruntled employee, or is there something to it, in your view?
Well, John Bolton admitted several days ago that he destroyed all of his notes at the White House. He never took any notes home. So this entire book is based on his recollection of what took place during his tenure. So there's some issue there about the credibility of the details that are laid out there. But what's interesting about Bolton now in this environment, this very polarized environment in the country, is that this once dangerous, fire-breathing warmonger, by taking on President Trump, is now seen as a wise and prudent sage of diplomacy and statecraft. And I think that poses some problems for people who are believing everything that's in Bolton's book. It could be the way Bolton credibly and honestly remembers what happened, but there's another side to every single one of these episodes. So I think there's going to be some issue for Bolton going forward as to whether or not he can stand up to the demands for evidence that this is the way things played out. He has no notes, and all he's able to say is, this is what I remember. I'm not sure that's the best way to record history.
Why do you think you wrote the book, John?
I have no idea. I mean, I can't imagine what is going on in anybody else's mind. But what seems to be the case is it's a very vengeful tone here. And I think also, from what I know about Bolton secondhand, I don't know the man firsthand, so I want to be very respectful here, is that I think he was genuinely shocked that an unorthodox chief executive running a very disorderly foreign policy process didn't take his advice. And Bolton considers himself a brilliant practitioner of foreign policy, and yet on many issues, the president rejected that advice. I'm not sure Bolton got over that.
All right, let's go to Beijing, to Victor Gar. Victor, Bolton talks about the relationship between President Trump and the Chinese President Xi Jinping. In fact, he says that Trump at one point links talks about tariffs, the trade talks that took place, with China buying more from United States farmers, and if China would buy more from U.S. farmers, then that would help Trump win votes in farm states. What was the view from China on that?
Well, from the Chinese perspective, the China market is big, the biggest consumer market in the world by now, and the Chinese demand for American products, especially agricultural products, is very huge. So when things are normalized, of course, China wants to buy as much agricultural products, industrial products from the United States as possible. The demand will be long and sustainable, and the Chinese consumers can pay for that. This will be good for the American farmers, of course. But who is holding back the Chinese import from the United States? It's President Trump and his advisors. It's the tariff wars imposed on China by the United States. As a result, there are frictions, there are problems in China-US trade, and both countries are suffering. So I hope, let's normalize China-US relations. Let's take away all these hindrances and let the American farmers directly sell as much as possible to China, rather than trading becomes a political tool.
Nathan, in the book, Bolton is pretty forthright in some of his opinions on the president. He did an interview with the United States network ABC News. He was interviewed by one of its reporters, Martha Raddatz. Let's listen to part of what that interview said.
You say that you were astonished by what you saw. A president for whom getting reelected was the only thing that mattered, even if it meant endangering or weakening the nation?
Well, I think he was so focused on the reelection that longer-term considerations fell by the wayside. So if he thought he could get a photo opportunity with Kim Jong-un at the demilitarized zone in Korea, there was considerable emphasis on the photo opportunity and the press reaction to it, and little or no focus on what such meetings did for the bargaining position of the United States.
So, Nathan, you said earlier on that everything that Trump did was about his re-election. So everything that he did was also transactional. He didn't do anything for the good of his office or the country. It was always something for himself.
Well, if they coincide, and this is Bolton, but also other people's view, if they coincide with the national interest, Donald Trump's having to go along with it. But, you know, I was talking about the re-election, but also it's about winning the next news cycle. The US president essentially looks at his presidency here, and John Bolton bears this out in the book, as about winning the next news cycle, about being top of the news, about being seen to be in a photo op. And what I think about this book should be read by is everyone who does diplomacy, and I'm sure it has been, with the United States, because what it essentially says is that no matter what the officials say in briefings and negotiations or the trade deal, or whether it's talking about the DPRK's nuclear weapons, the US president is happy to basically throw everything out the window if he feels that it will benefit him in the cycle or in his re-election bid. Witness the China trade deal, for example. You know, there was huge, I covered it in minute detail, and there was huge reaction when the deal fell apart in May, and there was finger pointing at China. But essentially, the US president was desperate to get this back on track. Not of the details or whatever, it's because he wanted to show a win. He had the US, Mexico, Canada, the USMCA agreement going through it, and he wanted to come to the election with some sort of deal. He knows that the American people won't go through the entire deal. He knows the optics. Now this, for adversaries and allies alike, is a real lesson. Is Donald Trump welded in any principle or ideology? And John Bolton says no. So does that mean essentially he's a paper tiger? Question mark.
Allan Lichtman, Bolton makes much of the fact that President Trump did not study or prepare for meetings with foreign leaders. This is what Bolton told Stephen Colbert on the CBS television network. Let's listen.
The president didn't study the facts of the issues he had to discuss with these leaders. He didn't prepare to the extent he should. There were some cases where we were able to brief him. He would say that he could make a nuclear deal with Iran in a day, that he could just size Kim Jong-un in a few minutes, and they could cut a deal very quickly. It's just not realistic, but he never understood that. I always had the feeling, sitting in these meetings, that they could see right through him. It was not a fair fight.
Allan, as a historian, how troublesome is that?
I think it's incredibly troublesome. You really have to have some understanding of the world, some understanding of history, and some vision and objective beyond what is good for you in the next news cycle, what is going to excite your base, and what is going to help you to get reelected. But this isn't surprising at all. In my book, The Case for Impeachment, which was published over 3 years ago, I tracked through Donald Trump's multi-decade history as a businessman, and that's always the way he operated as a businessman. He never studied the details of any of the projects that he was involved in. He just believed he can talk his way into anything he wanted and persuade anyone to go along with him, and none of the details mattered to him whatsoever, and that's exactly the way he's operated as president. We see it not only in the way he's been played by these much more canny foreign leaders like Vladimir Putin. We see it right before our eyes right now in what's going on in this country, in this, the second greatest disease crisis in the history of the nation. He hasn't bothered to learn anything about the pandemic, COVID-19 whatsoever. Instead, he's mongering the most ridiculous quackery. You should drink bleach or Lysol or stick a UV light inside of you to cure it. And now realizing he has no understanding, no handle, no answers on the pandemic. He's just pretending it's gone away. It's all of a piece. And that's why John Bolton's book is so believable. I can't verify the details, obviously, but the big picture fits with everything I've known about Donald Trump, having studied him for so many years.
Right, John, I want to get back to what we talked about a moment ago. That's the situation in Ukraine. Bolton says that Trump linked his suspension of $391 million in security aid to Ukraine to demands that Ukraine publicly announce an investigation into alleged wrongdoings by Joe Biden. And that, of course, led to the impeachment. Would Bolton's testimony at the impeachment made a difference?
I have no way of knowing. I mean, it's a complete hypothetical. What we do know is, Anand, that he had the opportunity to testify. He had the opportunity to present what he believes to be damning evidence of Trump's malfeasance, if not worse.
What I mean, John, is if he had said at the impeachment hearing what he's written in his book, would that have made a difference?
I don't think so. No, I mean, the impeachment outcome was baked in before the process even began. So I don't think it would have made any difference at all. And look, it's very selective criticism here. You can talk about this one particular aid package, but for anyone to think that an administration that has sanctioned the oligarchs that are closest to Putin and propping up his kleptocratic regime, that have sold arms over and over again to Ukraine, that are involved in an energy war to diminish Europe's dependence on Russian oil and natural gas, that somehow this is a man who's giving away the American store to the Russians, is a very difficult argument to make.
Victor Gar, President Trump was trying to foster better ties, better relations with China, but in many instances, John Bolton disagreed with him. Here's what Bolton told CNN.
I was equally outraged when he told me and told Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross to stop basically the interagency consideration of sanctions that we were looking at recommending to him to impose on China because of the treatment of the Uyghurs. Same situation came up with respect to the demonstrators in Hong Kong, with respect to a statement marking the anniversary of the suppression of the Tiananmen Square demonstrations. It came up over and over.
Okay, unfortunately, we've lost Victor Gar for the moment. Nathan, what did you make of that? The fact that, where you had the president trying to improve ties with China and Bolton disagreeing with him?
Well, what you've got in this administration is literally Donald Trump at the top and everyone fighting for his attention. There is no discipline whatsoever. So you may have, for example, Mike Pompeo. We know how he likes to China bash, blame China every day for something different. But what was really revealing is, there'd been this big pressure about Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, within the Congress, et cetera, et cetera. And then the US president sits down with Chinese officials, including Xi Jinping, in Osaka. I was there end of June 2018 at the G20 summit. And President Xi explains the policy, talks a little bit about Xinjiang's history, et cetera, and officials. And the US president goes, yeah, no, I agree with your policy. I get it. This is the difference between a normal administration and a Trump administration. Donald Trump is his own man, and no matter what the agendas are of the different agencies, he will just go with his gut, what he thinks, and go forward. And that, to me, is everything. And you've seen it with the trade deal as well. And you've seen it with Hong Kong. There's been some real resistance from the White House about being okay with all these bills coming through Congress. The Secretary of State announced all these measures, and the Trump White House sort of announced them. They're sort of scaled back a little bit. So, never judge a man by his words, but by his deeds. But when it comes to the US president, doubly so.
All right. Well, fortunately, Victor has rejoined us. Victor, great to see you again. I want to put that same question to you, Victor. And the question was that, Trump at one point was trying to improve relations between Washington and Beijing, but in many instances, John Bolton disagreed with him. And What did you make of that?
Well, first of all, I think reading the book by John Bolton, it gives you shivers. Why? Because the combination of Trump and Bolton in the White House scheming about all these international relations, probably we should be grateful that more disasters have not happened yet. That's number one. Number two is that Trump's approach to China-US relations is to destroy that relations first and then become the so-called savior by salvaging whatever that he can and turning himself into a big hero.
Yeah.
I think the world has now realized his true nature. China has fully realized his true nature, and the American people will be better served if they realize what Trump is really about. We do not need this kind of person to navigate China-US relations. He's really leading China-US relations into a big abyss.
Yeah. Victor, I want to stay with you because President Trump has been criticized for his response to the coronavirus pandemic. He says that he responded very quickly and he responded very decisively. Bolton disagrees. Let's listen to what Bolton had to say about that.
The evidence is unmistakable that the experts early on in January at the CDC, the National Institutes of Health, at the National Security Council were sounding the alarm. I think there was an empty chair in the Oval Office because the president did not want to hear bad news about Xi Jinping, his friend. He did not want to hear bad news about the cover-up of the virus in China or its potential effect on the China trade deal that he wants so much. And he didn't want to hear about the potential impact of a pandemic on the American economy and its effect on his reelection. Turning a blind eye to all these early signs, I think, hampered the country's ability to deal with this and continues to do so.
We know that, Victor, that at one time, President Trump was very effusive in his praise of President Xi Jinping and his relationship with China, but on other occasions, he was very insulting towards China.
Absolutely. I think, first of all, Donald Trump's approach to the coronavirus pandemic is anti-China. It is lacking in caring for the American people. And someone in the United States does have blood of the American people on his hands. And history definitely will come up to condemn such malfeasance or negligence or even crime against the American people by their top leader in handling pandemic like this COVID-19. That's number one. I personally don't take much delight in the so-called praises of Donald Trump of the Chinese leaders or China as a whole, because he is talking in those terms as if it will help his presidential election itself. So I think we need to see what he is really up to in dealing with China-US relations. He's turned the China-US relations, the most important bilateral relations, into a pawn for advancing his own presidential re-election chances. And I think the Chinese people and the American people are much better than that.
Right.
We should really control the Sino-US relations, and we need to prevent any major hiccup or major ups and downs in that relations. Why? Because that will be for our own fundamental interest of the Chinese people and the American people. We can no longer afford to have China-US relations manhandled by President Trump.
Allan, how disturbing is that, the fact that there is no continuity, there is no policy really, there's no consistency. President Trump just changes his view to meet changing circumstances.
Well, there is a policy, there is a consistency, and John Bolton points it out. It begins and ends with Trump, and that's it. He doesn't know history. He doesn't understand the world. He thought Finland was part of Russia. He didn't know that Britain had nuclear weapons. But I want to comment on a couple of things that were said previously.
Yeah.
Number one, would John Bolton's testimony have made a difference? Irrelevant. It was not John Bolton's duty to try to figure out what the Senate may or may not do based on his testimony. It was his duty as a patriotic American simply to tell what he knows. And the notion that he may not have made a difference is no excuse. Moreover, I think it would have made a difference. No, Trump wouldn't have been convicted, but I think, maybe 2 or 3 more votes might have turned and gone along with Mitt Romney to convict him, and you might have had a majority, a slight bipartisan majority to convict, and that wouldn't have thrown him out. but that would make a big difference. Finally, on U.S.-China relations, I don't disagree with anything that the gentleman said, but China's got to take a lot of responsibility here, too. China's a dictatorship. It's not President Trump who threw the Uyghurs in concentration camps.
Right.
It's not President Trump who is cracking down on democracy in Hong Kong. It's not President Trump who committed the atrocities in Tiananmen Square. It's the Chinese. This goes both ways, not just one way.
Okay, Victor, you want to comment on that for a moment?
Well, I disagree with this American panelist. I think we need to really understand the situation in China, in Xinjiang, for example. And the evils we are faced with in Xinjiang are the separatism, terrorism, and extremism. And
Now
don't
you sound
forget,
like Donald
Xinjiang
Trump.
itself borders with 8
Exactly like Donald
Okay,
Trump.
Alan, give him a chance to finish. Give him a chance to finish. Go ahead.
Unbelievable.
Xinjiang is much, much more arduous than the whole geographical situations faced by the United States as a continental power. Therefore, don't underestimate the spillover from Afghanistan, where the war led by the United States there has lasted for 20 years, and there is still no sure sign of that's ending.
All right, I want to move on. I want to move on. All right, thanks, Victor.
Of course, of the fight against the 3 evils in Xinjiang.
Okay, I want to move on. John, I want to bring you into this conversation. You know, as Nathan said earlier on, that this is a book which is about foreign affairs. It's about diplomacy. Bolton writes that Trump had to be persuaded from meeting with the Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif because of fears that Zarif would take advantage of the president. And then on another occasion, Bolton says that no one dared leave Trump alone with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader. Now, we know that these meetings usually take place with very big delegations, so why would there be these kinds of fears?
I think what we're missing here, Anand, is, we're so busy looking at the process and how disorderly the process may be, and we're not looking at the outcome. The president, in the end, decided to not meet with Mr. Zarif, so the meeting didn't happen. And with Kim Jong-un, yes, President Trump is under some strange sense that there's a love affair between him and Kim, and that flattering Kim and showing him videos of what real estate development could mean for the economic prosperity of a country that Kim doesn't care about will somehow make things, will deliver a preferred outcome. So some things that were recommended by Bolton took place, some didn't. But I think the most important thing here is John Bolton is an aide. He works for the president. He's not the president. He does have a political action committee, though, that's got about $5 million in it, and he flirted with running for president years ago. So if he really feels that President Trump is so incompetent, he should run against him for president or have his own campaign in 2024. That's how we decide policy in America, democratic elections. So that's another option for John Bolton going forward.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. That was, I'm sorry, Alan, we've run out of time. We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.